So this is the first of the truly modern wheat varieties. This is Hobbit, and it's a semi-dwarf wheat variety, about 70 centimetres tall, same height as modern wheats, and you can see it's also got a very large ear. And the reason for this is that the plant, when it's forming the ear, there's less competition for carbohydrate to go into the stem because it's shorter, so it needs less carbohydrate to build it, so that extra carbohydrate can go into the ear, produce more grain sites, and you can increase the yield. You can also put more nitrogen on it because it's shorter, there's less leverage, so this is the advantage of a semi-dwarf wheat variety. So this plot of Hobbit has got a landrace behind it. You can see the difference in height. So semi-dwarf wheats, they started off with the work of Norman Borlaug, the Green Revolution in Mexico, and then UK wheat breeders were a bit slower to take up the semi-dwarf wheats. It was in the 60s that PBI started experimenting, Francis Lupton, and it was 1976 before Hobbit appeared, because it needed a lot of back crossing to adapt the Mexican genetics to the UK. Back crossing is where you take an adapted parent and cross it with your exotic material, and then you cross the progeny of that cross back onto your adapted parent or your recurrent parent. And in this case the recurrent parent was Capel Dupree, but there was also a complex cross with material from Professor Marshall and some of the other PBI material at the time. So it took a very long time to adapt the semi-dwarf wheat genetics to the UK. This is Avalon from the early 1980s. This uses the high quality bread making genetics from Maris Widgeon and combines it with the semi-dwarf trait. So it's one of the first successful semi-dwarf bread making wheats, because Hobbit was just a feed because it got its poor quality from Professor Marshall. And this is Norman, which is one of John Bingham's varieties from the 1980s. Also bred varieties like Galahad, Longbow, and then Riband and Hereward. So PBI were very successful in the 80s, producing the succession of semi-dwarf, very stiff strawed varieties. So Norman is very much an improved version of Hobbit. So Hobbit did break down against yellow rust. It was also quite weak strawed, even though it's shorter, whereas Norman is short and stiff, very large ear. Again, only a feed quality, but you could put Norman in the recommended list plots today and it would look very much like a modern wheat variety, even though it's over 30 years old. So this is Septoria tritici on Riband, which is a variety from the late 80s, typical of the semi-dwarf, very high yielding wheats that PBI were producing in the 80s. Unbeknown to them, they'd accidentally introduced greater susceptibility to Septoria. Now, one reason is that when you've got a shorter wheat, the Septoria spores, they spread up the wheat plant from the base to the most important leaf, the flag leaf, by rain splash. And when you've got a shorter plant, it's got a shorter distance to travel, so by making the plant shorter, you do make the plant more susceptible to Septoria. But also, perhaps more seriously, they had accidentally introduced 3 major alleles for susceptibility from Professor Marshall and a German variety, Highness Pico. And these were crosses that were made in the 60s and 70s before semi-dwarf wheats. They were made for good reasons, to increase yield, and in the case of Highness Pico, to increase yellow rust resistance. But inadvertently, they'd replaced the traits for resistance found in Capel Dupree with traits for susceptibility from Professor Marshall and Highness Pico. And this didn't seem such a problem at the time because wheats were taller, but once they've introduced semi-dwarf wheats like Hobbit, Norman, etc., then the problem became worse. So poor old Riband has actually got all three areas, major areas for susceptibility, and it was always a bit of a problem with Septoria. Luckily, that's also the time when the first fungicides are being used. They were very effective at first, but since the 1990s we've got more and more problems with fungicide resistance. And one of the key fungicides that doesn't have problems with resistance, chlorothalonil, is being banned, and the last time for use will be the 20th of May 2020. So since the 1990s, breeders have been more concentrating again on disease resistance, especially Septoria. This is one of the first big breakthroughs for Septoria. Clare, which had excellent resistance at the time. Then there was Robigus, which features in about half of as a parent in about half the varieties we're growing at the moment. And they introduced far better Septoria resistance than the likes of Consort and Riband and Norman, etc. Good varieties as they were at the time, they did have this problem with Septoria.